I'm Sarah Walker. I'm a Geelong-based artist and I make work about death, disaster and catastrophe. And I look at ways of using surprising modes of engagement with those topics to open up conversations about the things we struggle to talk about. Like a lot of Australians my age, I grew up with a couple of McCubbin prints on the wall, which were slowly bleached blue in the sun over decades of display. And his work and the work of the Australian Impressionists really informs the way that settler Australians think about our own history. His narratives, his pioneering narratives are really part of us. And so when Geelong Gallery approached me and asked me to respond to A Bush Burial, which is a huge iconic work, I was really excited and also really interested in the way that McCubbin represents the Australian relationship with landscape and place in a way that's quite romantic, but also contains a lot of loss and devastation and death. And there's a real quiet, melancholy grace to this work that I was very interested in responding to. So Lisa from the gallery asked if I'd be interested in making a text work in response to the painting. And I was immediately struck by the image of the woman standing at the graveside with the child, who I found out quickly was McCubbin's wife, Annie, which was super thrilling for me. I'm really interested in the idea of the relationship between the painter and the model. They were newly married, they just had their first child, and there's this really extraordinary intimacy that must have existed when she was modelling for him, which she did for a lot of paintings. So I was interested in this idea of creating a script between them that conveyed something of the intimacy of their relationship, but also uncovered these things that we don't know very much about, like, for example, a lot of things about Annie personally. We know a lot about Frederick, we know a lot about his family, we know that he and Annie had a really great relationship, but she is quite silent in the archive, and I was interested in giving her voice and starting to unpack things that she might have been thinking and feeling in modelling for this work. So McCubbin had experienced a lot of loss and grief in his life. His father died falling down a flight of stairs. His brother was killed in a flour mill accident, like terrible, horrific, horrible experiences. And a few years after A Bush Burial was painted, he and Annie had their 3-year-old daughter, Mary. She fell out of her pusher and hit her head on cobblestones and died, which is just, inexpressibly terrible, the most awful thing you could possibly think of. And I was interested in this image in A Bush Burial of Annie standing there grieving a loss, this anonymous grave, and then knowing that in a few short years she would be grieving a real loss, and one of the most horrifying losses you could possibly imagine. So I started to think about the idea of her interior monologue being represented through the text, but also this idea of a kind of speculative fictional visitation where this thing that is going to happen in the future starts to intrude on the present, and she starts to have kind of a vision of the loss of her daughter while she's standing there modelling for grief. So as the conversation between them progresses, Annie's thoughts start getting more and more intrusive until suddenly there's this explosion of invisible text across the wall, which turns into this sort of cascading flood of ink, representing the kind of chaos and horror of the death of this child that is approaching them, that is coming for them. And I'm really interested in this image of her standing totally static while Frederick paints her, while inside her mind there's all this content happening, which I think is there's something nicely representative about the way that she is so 2D and flat in the representations we see of her, and there's something nice about all of this richness that exists below the surface. And that richness is sometimes a bit sassy and sometimes full of grief and humour and complexity. I think it can be really easy when you're looking at these really iconic works to treat them with real reverence and to treat the painter with that same kind of reverence. And I think the thing that I really like about McCubbin's work is that there's real depth of feeling to it. I think knowing a bit about his life and knowing the grief that he had experienced before he painted this work really gives you this sense of connection with this suffering that he's feeling, which is, these are universal types of suffering. Loss is one of the great universal truths. And I think there's also something interesting about A Bush Burial is a beautiful, quiet, graceful painting. And the types of death that McCubbin had experienced were not quiet and graceful. They were really, really traumatic. And I think death often doesn't go the way we hope it will. We often hope that it's going to happen in this really cinematic, beautiful, elegant way, and in my experience that is not the case most of the time. Usually something absurd is happening, someone's in the wrong place, everything that you're imagining is going to be really beautiful and soft isn't, and it feels a bit sort of cosmically disappointing. And I think A Bush Burial kind of allows McCubbin to think about death in a way that is really beautiful. And I think my work responding to that painting is kind of a way of saying, what if death could be something that we spoke about? What if it wasn't terrifying? What if it wasn't something that we stop it up and push down below the surface? How do we start having conversations about what death is and what it could be? So with this work, obviously we're dealing with an extremely heavy topic, and so there's a real necessity for lightness of touch. I also work as a writer, which is can be helpful in thinking about ways to approach language in this way. And so some of the things that Annie is thinking while she's sitting next to her child are quite irreverent. And then that lightness opens up the space for that gravity to really settle. I think it's a real, it's a thing that comedians talk about all the time, that once people are with you with laughter, they will be with you when you go deep. It's something I'm interested in playing with this work and with this event in particular. So there's some real dark content in here, but there's also a certain lightness, and there's a real lightness in the way that Annie and Frederick relate to each other, which I think helps. I think it helps to know that they had a really good relationship. So when you start thinking about this terrible event, this death of their child that happens later on in their lives, there is a hope in the fact that they've got a real connection and that they really care for each other. So I am an emerging artist, and it is really, really very moving and a bit overwhelming and thrilling to be making work in this place, in the Geelong Gallery, and responding to a work that is so iconic in the Australian imagination. It feels really exciting to be able to bring that kind of freshness to a work that is so weighty, and it feels kind of satisfying to make a work that is so weightless in many ways. This UV text doesn't exist unless you're looking for it, and you have to uncover it. I think there's something interesting in that relationship with the history of art, the history of this country, that there is always something to be mined and something that you can keep looking for and uncover.